The knife was already at her throat when Alira Hartley realized the wedding gown she wore had been chosen by a dead woman. She did not know that yet. All she knew, in that first frozen second, was the cold metal pressing against her skin, and the guard's low voice telling her not to scream. The corridor outside the throne hall was empty, except for torches that hissed against the stone walls, and nobody was coming to help her. Not on her wedding night. Not in this fortress. "Move," the guard said. "The king wants you in the East Tower." Now, Alira's heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced her voice steady. "I was told my chambers were in the north wing." Plans changed. He pushed her forward, and the knife lowered just enough to let her breathe again. "Ask him yourself, if you're brave enough." She was not brave, not yet, but she walked anyway, because the alternative was worse, and because 3 days earlier her father had signed a treaty that placed her entire future in the hands of a man she had never met. A man the border packs called the Alpha King, though few of them said his name out loud. Cale Ashgrave, the one who had taken the crown from a bloodline that was not his own, and somehow made every neighboring pack too afraid to ask how. The East Tower door opened before she reached it. A tall man stood in the frame, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with eyes the color of a winter lake. He wore no crown, no ceremonial cloak, nothing that marked him as royalty, except the way every guard in the hallway straightened the moment he appeared. "Leave us," Cale said, and the guard who had held the knife to her throat vanished down the stairs so fast that Alira understood, in that instant, exactly how much power this man held over the people around him. She stepped into the tower room. It was sparse: a bed, a writing desk, a single window overlooking a courtyard she could not see in the dark. Nothing about it looked like a bridal chamber. It looked like a cell someone had tried, badly, to make comfortable. "Sit," Cale said. "I would rather stand." Something flickered across his face, not anger, something closer to surprise, before it disappeared. "Suit yourself." He crossed to the window, his back to her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Alira used the silence to study him, the way her father had taught her to study any dangerous animal. Watch the hands, watch the shoulders, watch for the moment before it moves. "You should know what this marriage is," Cale said finally, still facing the glass. "It is not a marriage. It is a wall between your father's pack and mine, built out of paper, and your name. Nothing more." "I was told the same thing by my father," Alira said, though he used gentler words. "Your father is a diplomat. I am not." Cale finally turned to face her, and up close his eyes were even colder than she had first thought. Not cruel exactly, but guarded, like a door bolted shut from the inside. "You will have a room. You will have food, clothing, protection. You will not have my attention, my affection, or my trust. Ask nothing of me and I will ask nothing of you. That is the arrangement." Alira's chest tightened, but she kept her chin level. She had expected coldness. She had not expected to feel, standing in front of this man, like she was being catalogued rather than seen. "And if I refuse the arrangement?" For the first time, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it held no warmth at all. "You won't." He was right, and they both knew it. There was no path home for her now. Her father's pack was smaller, weaker, and utterly dependent on the peace this marriage had purchased. If Alira caused trouble here, the trouble would not fall on her alone. It would fall on every person she had grown up loving, 3 days' ride south of this fortress. "Then I accept the arrangement," she said quietly, "but I want something in return." Cale's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he had not expected her to negotiate. "Name it." "A private room. One that locks from the inside, and where no one enters without my permission." She had thought of this the moment the guard grabbed her arm in the hallway. If she was going to survive in this place, she needed one space in the world that belonged only to her. Cale studied her for a long moment, the winter lake eyes unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Granted. Anything else?" "No." "Good." He walked past her to the door and opened it, a clear signal that the conversation, and perhaps the entire relationship they were about to share, had ended before it began. "A servant will show you to your chambers. Do not wander the fortress after dark. Not everyone here will be as patient with you as I am." The words should have sounded like a threat. Somehow, they sounded almost like a warning, meant to protect her. And that confusion, the way this man kept shifting between menace and something gentler underneath it, would follow Alira long after she left that tower room. Her new chambers turned out to be modest but well kept, tucked into a quiet corridor on the second floor, far from the noise of the great hall. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a small writing desk, beneath a window that looked out over a herb garden gone half wild with neglect. The servant who led her there, a soft-spoken older woman named Netta, lingered in the doorway after setting down Alira's single travel bag. "If you need anything, my lady, ring the bell by the door," Netta said. Then, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for anyone in the hall, she added quietly, "Best to keep to yourself here. Fewer questions, fewer troubles." "What kind of troubles?" Alira asked. Netta's mouth pressed into a thin line. "The kind that don't get spoken about in daylight." Before Alira could press further, the older woman gave a small curtsy and slipped away, leaving her alone in a room that did not yet feel like hers. Alira sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, to shake. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of everything. The smell of unfamiliar stone and wood smoke, the sound of unfamiliar footsteps in unfamiliar halls. The weight of a wedding ring she had not chosen, from a man who had made it painfully clear that this arrangement was a wall and nothing else. But Alira had not survived 16 years in a border pack, watching her father navigate treaties with wolves twice his pack's size, by falling apart at the first sign of trouble. She unpacked slowly, methodically, and near the bottom of her travel bag, her fingers found the one object she had smuggled past the guards without anyone noticing. A small leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft from years of handling, its pages already half filled with a private cipher she had invented as a lonely child in her father's house. She had built the cipher at 11 years old, after a tutor read her journal without permission and mocked her for the things she'd written about missing her mother. She had cried for a single night, and then spent the next 3 months designing a code so specific to her own memories, her own private references, that no outsider could ever crack it without knowing the inside of her own mind. It used symbols for common words, substitutions tied to memories only she held, small deliberate errors that would throw off anyone trying to break it through pattern alone. She had used it for years to write down her private thoughts, her fears, her small triumphs. She had never imagined she would need it here, in a fortress full of strangers, married to a man who had just told her, quite plainly, that he intended to be a stranger to her forever. She opened the journal to a fresh page and began to write. The pen moved slowly, forming symbols instead of letters, translating her racing thoughts into a private language only she could read. Married 3 days ago on paper. Tonight I finally met him. He is not what the stories say. Not a monster exactly, but something colder, controlled. Every word measured before it leaves his mouth. He wants nothing from me but silence, and I think that frightens me more than anger would. A man who shouts, you can predict. A man who hides everything behind a locked door. I do not yet know how to read him. She paused, chewing the end of the pen, and thought of Netta's warning. Fewer questions, fewer troubles. The kind that don't get spoken about in daylight. She wrote that down too. Something is wrong in this place. I can feel it the way you feel a storm 2 days before it breaks. Not yet visible, but pressing on the air. I do not know what it is. But I intend to find out, quietly, carefully, the way Father taught me. And when I do, I will not forget it. I will write it down, every word, every lie, every silence that should not exist. If this journal is the only thing in this fortress that truly belongs to me, then it will hold every truth this fortress tries to bury. She closed the journal and pressed it flat beneath a loose floorboard she discovered near the foot of the bed, one of several small defensive habits her father had drilled into her since childhood. Never keep valuables where the first search will find them. Then she blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to unfamiliar sounds settle around her, distant voices, a door closing somewhere below, the wind moving through the neglected garden outside her window. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she drifted close to it, she found herself replaying the moment in the tower room when Cale's careful mask had slipped, just slightly, at the word wall. As if even he did not fully believe the arrangement he had just described. As if there was something underneath the coldness that he was working very hard to keep locked away. She did not yet know that this fortress held 6 years of secrets waiting to be uncovered, or that the cipher she had built as a wounded child would one day become the only weapon capable of bringing down a king. She only knew, as the first night in her new life finally pulled her toward an uneasy sleep, that Netta's warning had settled into her chest like a stone, and that some instinct older than fear was already telling her to pay attention, to watch, to remember everything. By morning, the fortress looked less like a threat and more like a puzzle. Sunlight spilled through her window, catching dust in slow golden drifts above the wild herb garden. And for a moment, Illyra allowed herself to imagine a version of this place that was not dangerous at all, simply unfamiliar, simply new. That illusion lasted exactly as long as it took Netta to return with a breakfast tray and a face drawn tight with something that looked very much like worry. "There was trouble in the west corridor last night," Netta said, setting the tray down without meeting Illyra's eyes. "A servant went missing. Second one this season." Illyra sat up straighter. "Missing? Has anyone searched for her?" "The king says she left in the night, ran off with a merchant from the valley towns." Netta's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the blanket at the foot of the bed, an unnecessary task that seemed more like a way to avoid Illyra's gaze than genuine tidiness. "That's the official story. But you don't believe it." Netta finally looked up, and in her eyes, Illyra saw something she recognized instantly, because she had felt it herself the night before, standing in the tower room across from a man whose calm concealed something colder underneath. Fear, not of Illyra, of the question itself, and of what might happen to anyone who asked it too loudly. "I believe what I'm told to believe, my lady," Netta said quietly, "and so should you, if you want a peaceful life here." She left without another word, and Illyra sat alone with her cooling breakfast and a growing certainty that the official story of the missing servant was, in fact, a lie. She thought of the floorboard beneath her bed, of the journal waiting there in its private cipher, and of the promise she had written the night before. "I will write it down, every word, every lie, every silence that should not exist." The fortress had already given her the first one. The scream came from the courtyard just after midnight, and Illyra was awake before she even understood why. She sat upright in the dark, heart pounding, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, so complete, she almost convinced herself she had dreamed it. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps below her window, low, urgent voices, and the unmistakable clang of a gate being thrown open. She crossed to the window and pressed herself against the cold glass, watching torchlight bob across the herb garden as guards moved toward the outer wall. She could not see what had happened. She could only see the shape of men running, and hear, faint but unmistakable, Cale's voice cutting through the confusion, low and commanding, ordering someone to seal the east gate. By the time Netta arrived with breakfast the next morning, the fortress had already agreed on its story. "A hunting accident," the servants were whispering. One of the border guards, a young man named Corin, had been gravely injured chasing a wolf that strayed too close to the walls. He would recover, they said, though slowly. Illyra listened to the story twice, once from Netta, once from a pair of kitchen girls she passed in the corridor, and both times, something in her chest tightened at the details. A hunting accident happening at midnight, inside the fortress walls, close enough to the courtyard that a scream could wake her from 2 floors up. It did not add up. Not the way a true story should. She said nothing. She had learned, over one single day in this place, that saying nothing was often the safest choice. But she went back to her room, lifted the loose floorboard, and opened her journal to a fresh page. "Guard injured last night. Story says hunting accident near the east gate. But the sound came from the courtyard, not the wall, and no wolf would come that close to torches and stone. Something happened here that they do not want spoken of. I am starting to understand what Netta meant." She sat with the pen still in her hand for a long moment after that, thinking of the missing servant from the night before, and of how quickly these stories were assembled. Clean, simple, unquestionable on the surface, and yet somehow always missing a piece that refused to fit. 3 days passed before Illyra saw Cale again. She had begun, in that time, to map the fortress the way her father had once mapped rival packs' territories, not with force, but with patience, noticing which corridors emptied at certain hours, which guards spoke freely, and which ones flinched at the mention of the king's name, which rooms stayed locked, even during the daylight hours, when the rest of the fortress bustled with servants and business. She noticed that the west wing, where the missing servant had supposedly last been seen, was avoided by nearly everyone, as if the corridor itself carried some kind of quiet contamination. She was standing near the edge of that corridor, pretending to examine a tapestry, while she listened to two guards murmur just out of sight, when a voice behind her made her flinch. "You've been wandering." Cale stood a few paces away, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Not anger. Something closer to curiosity, sharpened at the edges with wariness. "I was exploring my new home," Elira said, keeping her voice light. "You did not forbid that. I told you not to wander after dark. It is midday. Then I have followed your instructions perfectly." She met his eyes, refusing to look away first, and for a moment, the corridor felt very small and very quiet. "Unless there is somewhere in this fortress I am not permitted to walk, even in daylight. If so, I would appreciate knowing where those places are, so I do not make the mistake again." Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite alarm, but close to it, gone as quickly as it appeared. "The west wing is under repair, unsafe flooring. Stay clear of it." It was, Elira thought, a remarkably specific lie for a man who claimed he owed her no explanations at all. She filed the detail away, along with the careful way his jaw tightened when he said it, and offered a small nod instead of an argument. "Understood." He studied her a moment longer, as if trying to determine whether her calm compliance was genuine or a performance, and then turned to leave. At the last moment he paused, half turned back toward her. "The guard from 3 nights ago, Corin." His voice was quieter now, almost careful. "If anyone speaks to you about him, the story is a hunting accident. Nothing more." "I had already heard the story," Elira said. "Then you understand, it does not need embellishing." He held her gaze for one more long second, something unreadable passing across his face. And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, with the same controlled precision as everything else about him. Elira waited until she was certain he would not return, before letting out the breath she had been holding. He had not needed to seek her out to repeat a story she already knew. Men who told the truth rarely felt compelled to reinforce it twice. That evening, she found her opportunity. Netta had mentioned, almost in passing, that the fortress kept a small archive room off the main library. Old treaty documents, correspondence between pacts, records of trade and border agreements going back decades. It was not, Netta assured her, a forbidden room, simply an unused one, tended by an elderly archivist named Pell, who kept irregular hours and rarely questioned who came and went. Elira found Pell exactly where Netta described, hunched over a stack of yellowed parchment beneath a single lamp, and introduced herself with the careful humility of a new bride, eager to understand her husband's kingdom. "I would like to read the treaty between my father's pack and the king's," she said, "the one that arranged our marriage. I never saw the final terms myself." Pell, flattered to be asked, and apparently starved for company, produced the document within minutes. Elira read it slowly, twice, memorizing details her father had explained to her before she left home. The exact terms of the truce, the borders it redrew, the specific language about who had requested peace first. The treaty stated, plainly, that her father's pack had petitioned for peace after a series of border skirmishes. Nothing in it suggested her father's pack had broken any prior agreement. Nothing in it matched what she had overheard, 2 days earlier, drifting up from the great hall below her window, Cale's voice, addressing his council, explaining that the marriage had become necessary because Elira's father's people had broken the previous truce first. She read the treaty a third time to be certain. The wording was unambiguous. Her father had sued for peace. He had not broken anything. Which meant Cale had lied to his own council, in his own hall, about the very reason this marriage existed. Elira thanked Pell, returned the document, and walked back to her chambers with her pulse hammering beneath her calm expression. She did not open the journal until the door was locked and the floorboard lifted. Overheard Cale telling his council that my father's pack broke the previous truce first, justifying this marriage as a necessary correction. I have now read the treaty myself. It says the opposite. My father requested peace, and the terms were negotiated in good faith on both sides. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a specific, deliberate lie, told to the people who trust him most. I do not yet know why he needs this particular lie, but I intend to find out, the same way I found this one, patiently, quietly, one document at a time. She sat back against the wall beneath her window, journal open on her knees, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving, to feel something other than fear. It was a small, cold thread of purpose, thin as spider silk, but it was there. If Cale Ashgrave intended to build his rule on careful, deliberate deception, then she intended to become the one person in this fortress who kept count. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself in small, careful ways. Elira learned to listen at doorways without appearing to listen, to ask questions that sounded like idle curiosity rather than investigation, to cross-reference what she heard in the Great Hall against what she found in old letters, trade records, and the occasional careless remark from a servant who had worked in the fortress long enough to remember things that were supposed to be forgotten. A trade dispute with a neighboring pack, publicly described as resolved through diplomacy, had actually ended with 3 of that pack's men never returning home. A tax increase, explained to the villages as necessary for border defense, coincided suspiciously with the completion of a private renovation project in the West Wing, the very corridor Cale had warned her away from, supposedly for unsafe flooring, though she noticed workers carrying furniture and fine cloth into it, rather than construction materials. Each discrepancy went into the journal, dated, ciphered, cross-referenced against her memory of where she had heard it and from whom. She began to understand that she was not simply recording a husband's small deceptions. She was documenting a pattern, careful and consistent, of a man who told each audience exactly what would keep them controlled, and who guarded the true story behind locked doors and forbidden corridors. She did not know yet what the true story was, but she was starting to believe it was larger and darker than a political marriage or a border dispute. She thought of the missing servant, of Corin's midnight injury and its clumsy cover story, of the West Wing that was somehow both unsafe and freshly furnished, and of the way Cale's careful composure cracked, just slightly, every time a particular subject came too close to the surface. 6 years, she wrote one night, though she did not yet know why the number came to her, only that some instinct told her this was not a story that would resolve itself quickly. If this is what I have found in 2 weeks, I suspect there are years of lies buried in this fortress, layered one on top of another, until no one living here can remember which version of any story is true. I intend to remember all of them. Every lie deserves a record, and I am beginning to think I am the only person here brave enough, or foolish enough, to keep one. She closed the journal, hid it beneath the floorboard, and lay awake a long while, listening to the fortress settle into its nightly silence, wondering how many more locked doors stood between her and the truth, and whether she would survive long enough to open all of them. The letter arrived hidden inside a bolt of gray wool cloth, and Elira almost missed it entirely. A merchant caravan had come through the fortress gates that morning, delivering supplies for the coming season, and Netta had been given the task of sorting fabric deliveries for the household. Elira had offered to help, mostly to escape the silence of her chambers, and it was pure chance that her hands found the folded parchment tucked between 2 layers of cloth, addressed in careful handwriting to no one at all. She almost handed it to Netta without a second thought. Then she noticed the seal, broken already. Someone had read it before her, and the first line visible at the fold. To whoever finds this, if my father's letters have not already reached him. Her fingers stilled. Netta had stepped out of the room to fetch more thread, giving Elira a narrow window of privacy. She unfolded the letter fully and read it standing exactly where she was, heart climbing into her throat with every line. The letter was from her own father. It was addressed, she realized with growing horror, to Cale directly, dated nearly 2 months before her wedding, long before the treaty had ever been finalized. In it, her father wrote plainly and with obvious desperation about wanting peace, about the losses his pack had already suffered in the border skirmishes, about his willingness to offer any reasonable terms to end the conflict before more lives were lost. It was, in every sense, a direct plea for the truce that eventually became her marriage. But the letter had never been delivered. Someone had intercepted it, kept it hidden inside a merchant's cloth delivery for reasons Elira could not begin to guess, and in the 2 months between her father writing this letter and Alira's wedding, Cale had stood before his own council and claimed the opposite, that her father's pack had broken the previous truce first, forcing his hand. He had not simply repeated an old lie, he had, at some point, received proof of the truth and buried it anyway. Alira folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her sleeve, just as Netta returned with an armful of thread, chattering about a delivery mix-up in the kitchen stores. Alira smiled, nodded, said all the right things, and felt nothing but the cold weight of paper against her wrist for the rest of the afternoon. That night, once the fortress had gone quiet, she copied the entire letter into her cipher, word for word, before hiding the original beneath the same floorboard as her journal. Her hand shook as she wrote, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to grief, the realization that her father had tried, desperately and honestly, to protect his people from exactly this outcome, and that his effort had been swallowed whole by a man who found it more useful to lie. "This is no longer a misunderstanding I might have gotten wrong," she wrote. "I have my father's own words in my hand. He begged for peace 2 months before the treaty was signed. Someone in this fortress intercepted that letter and hid it, and Cale built a public lie on top of the silence it left behind. I do not know if he ordered the letter hidden himself, or if someone did it for him, or if he simply found it useful once it was already buried. But either way, he has known the truth this entire time, and chosen, deliberately, to tell his people something else. This is the first lie I can prove beyond doubt. It will not be the last." The temptation to confront him was almost unbearable. For 3 days, Alira carried the knowledge of that letter like a stone in her chest, watching Cale across the great hall during the rare meals they shared, wondering what would happen if she simply placed her father's words on the table between them and asked him to explain. But she had learned enough about this fortress, and about the man who ruled it, to understand that confrontation without leverage was simply an invitation to be silenced. Quietly, efficiently, the way the missing servant had been silenced, the way Corin's midnight injury had been folded into a story about hunting accidents. So instead, she watched. She began paying closer attention to the people around Cale, rather than to Cale himself, cataloging the small hierarchy of trust that existed beneath his crown. There was Corwin, the king's chief advisor, a thin, sharp-eyed man who seemed to know everything happening in the fortress, and shared very little of it with anyone. There were the guards, most of whom treated Cale with a fear that bordered on reverence, and there was Rennick. Rennick Cole was different from the others in ways Alira noticed almost immediately. He was the king's beta, his oldest friend by all accounts, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh that seemed almost out of place inside the fortress's careful, guarded atmosphere. He was the only person Alira had seen speak to Cale without visible fear, the only one who occasionally teased him in front of the council, drawing rare, genuine smiles from a man who otherwise kept his expressions locked as tightly as his tower room door. He was also, Alira began to suspect, not entirely trusted with everything. She noticed it first during a council meeting she was permitted to observe from the gallery above the hall, a small privilege Cale had granted without explanation, perhaps simply because refusing her presence entirely would have raised more questions than allowing it. Corwin presented a report on the West Wing renovations, vague, full of technical language about structural repairs, and Alira watched Rennick's face carefully as he listened. He frowned, just slightly, at one particular detail, a mention of relocated household stores, and opened his mouth as if to ask a question, before Cale cut smoothly across the conversation, redirecting the council toward an unrelated matter of trade tariffs. It was such a small moment that Alira might have missed it if she had not been specifically watching for exactly this kind of thing. But she saw it clearly. Cale had deflected a question before his own oldest friend could finish asking it, and Rennick had let the deflection happen without pressing further, though his frown lingered a moment longer than the topic warranted. "He suspects something too," Alira wrote that night. "Not everything, perhaps not even much, but there are cracks in what Cale tells even the people closest to him, and Rennick notices them, the same way I do. I wonder if he has simply learned, over years of friendship, not to ask the questions that would force Cale to lie to his face. Or perhaps he asks them elsewhere, in private, and receives answers I have not yet heard. Either way, I think Rennick may be the one person in this fortress who wants the truth as badly as I do, even if he does not yet know it." She got her chance to test that theory less than a week later, in the fortress gardens, on an afternoon when a sudden rain sent most of the household scurrying indoors and left the covered walkway along the east wall nearly empty. Elira had gone there deliberately, having noticed over the past weeks that Rennick often took the same walkway during the quiet hour before evening meals, apparently to clear his head after long council sessions. He appeared exactly as she expected, his boots echoing against the stone as he walked, and stopped short when he noticed her standing at the railing, watching rain fall across the overgrown garden below. "My lady," he said, with a small bow that felt more genuine than the formal courtesies she usually received. "I didn't expect company out here." "Neither did I," Elira admitted, "though I find I prefer the rain to another quiet evening in my chambers." Rennick laughed, an easy, unguarded sound that seemed to belong to a different, less careful fortress than the one she had grown used to. "Cale keeps you rather isolated, doesn't he?" It was the first time anyone had said something so plainly critical of the king in her presence, and Elira chose her next words carefully, testing the boundaries of what Rennick might be willing to say. "He has made it very clear that isolation is part of our arrangement." "That sounds like him." Rennick leaned against the railing beside her, close enough for easy conversation, far enough to remain proper. "He wasn't always like this, you know. Careful. Guarded. When we were younger, before he took the crown, he used to talk for hours about the kind of ruler he wanted to become. Fair, honest with his people, even when honesty was difficult." He shook his head slightly, something wistful crossing his expression. "I don't know exactly when that changed, but it changed." Elira's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice light. "What do you think changed him?" Rennick was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, careful in a way that told Elira he was choosing his words with the same precision she used in her own cipher. "I think," he said slowly, "that becoming king cost him something he has never told me about, and I think, whatever it was, it is the reason he can no longer afford to be the man he wanted to be." He glanced sideways at her, something searching in his expression. "You've noticed things too, haven't you, since you arrived?" It was a dangerous question, and Elira understood, in the space of a single breath, that how she answered it might determine whether Rennick became an ally or a threat to everything she had recorded so far. "I've noticed that very little in this fortress is exactly what it appears to be," she said carefully. "Beyond that, I try not to speculate." Rennick studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he recognized the careful evasion for exactly what it was. But instead of pressing further, he simply nodded, as if satisfied by an answer she had not fully given. "A wise policy," he said. "For now, at least." The rain began to ease, and the moment passed, but Elira carried it with her back to her chambers that evening, turning it over in her mind, long after she had recorded it in her journal. Rennick suspects Cale is hiding something, and has suspected it for some time, perhaps longer than I have been in this fortress. He does not yet trust me enough to say more than careful hints, and I do not yet trust him enough to reveal what I have already learned. But I believe, given time, we may become useful to each other. He has access I do not. Years of friendship, a place at the council table, the ability to ask questions I am forbidden from asking. If I can earn his trust without revealing too much too soon, he may become the second set of eyes this investigation desperately needs. For now, I will continue watching. But I no longer believe I am the only person in this fortress capable of seeing the cracks in Cale Ashgrave's careful walls. The door to the west wing stood open for exactly 4 minutes, and Elira knew, the moment she saw it, that she would never get a clearer chance. She had been walking back from the kitchens with a tray of tea for her own chambers, a habit Netta had grown used to and no longer questioned, when she rounded the corner near the forbidden corridor, and found 2 servants, carrying folded linens, through a door that was normally locked, propped open with a wedge of wood, while they made a second trip. Neither of them noticed her pause at the far end of the hallway, tea tray balanced carefully, pulse suddenly hammering. Unsafe flooring, Cale had told her. Under repair. The corridor beyond the door looked nothing like a construction site. She could see, in the narrow slice of space visible past the servants' shoulders, polished floorboards, a hallway runner in deep blue, and the edge of what looked like a well-appointed sitting room. She had perhaps 4 minutes before the servants returned. It was not enough time for a full search, and she knew it. But it was enough time to walk the length of that corridor once, memorizing everything she could, before retreating to safety. She set her tea tray down on a side table, with as much composure as she could manage, and walked toward the open door, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. If anyone questioned her, she had already decided on her answer. She had gotten lost, still unfamiliar with the fortress after only a few weeks, and had wandered somewhere she should not have gone. The corridor beyond the door held 3 rooms. The first, its door ajar, revealed the sitting room she had glimpsed earlier. Clean, dust-free, clearly maintained, despite supposedly being closed for repairs. The second door was locked. The third stood open, and Alira stopped in the threshold, her breath catching. It was a nursery, small and untouched by time, exactly as if its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. A wooden cradle stood near the window, draped in fine cloth gone slightly yellow with age. A row of carved wooden toys sat arranged on a shelf, undisturbed by dust, despite the room's supposed abandonment, which told Alira, with sudden cold clarity, that someone still cleaned this room regularly, someone still cared for it. On the wall above the cradle hung a portrait, small and simply framed, of a young woman with dark hair and a gentle, uncertain smile. Alira did not recognize her, but something about the careful preservation of the room, the tenderness in how it had clearly been maintained, told her exactly what kind of story this space belonged to. She heard footsteps returning down the corridor and fled before she could examine the portrait more closely, slipping back through the door just as the 2 servants reappeared, carrying their second load of linens. She retrieved her tea tray from the side table, offered a polite nod as they passed, and walked the rest of the way to her chambers with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire fortress could hear it. She did not write in her journal that night until she had checked the corridor outside her door twice, certain no one had followed her. There is a nursery in the West Wing, hidden behind a story about unsafe flooring, maintained and cared for despite supposedly standing empty for years. A portrait of a young woman hangs above the cradle. I do not know who she is, but I believe, based on everything else I have learned in this fortress, that she is connected to whatever truth Kale has spent so much effort burying. A hunting accident that happened at midnight in a courtyard. A servant who vanished and was explained away with a story about running off with a merchant. A treaty built on a lie he had proof to disprove and hid anyway. And now, a nursery no one is supposed to know exists, kept exactly as though someone might return to it. I am beginning to believe there was a wife before me, and I am beginning to believe something happened to her that Cale Ashgrave does not want anyone to remember. The question consumed her for days, gnawing at the edges of every conversation, every careful observation. She could not ask Netta directly. The older woman's fear ran too deep, and Alira had come to respect it too much to push her into danger. She could not ask Cale, not without revealing that she had trespassed into the very corridor he had explicitly forbidden, and she was not yet certain enough of Rennick's trust to risk such a direct question. Instead, she returned to Pell's archive room, this time with a different request. I am curious about the fortress's history, she told the old archivist, keeping her tone light and pleasantly idle. Cale's family, his predecessors. I know so little about the man I married. Pell, delighted once again to have an audience, produced a small stack of genealogical records and household ledgers, and Alira spent 2 careful hours poring over names and dates, searching for anything that might explain the portrait, the nursery, the pattern of careful silence surrounding the West Wing. She found the answer buried in a household ledger from 6 years earlier, listed among routine expenses for the fortress. A wedding feast, dated, with a modest but clear entry for gowns and jewels for the Lady Adeline Ashgrave. Adeline. Alira copied the name carefully, along with the date, and continued searching. She found no further mention of Adeline anywhere in the records after that year. No household expenses attributed to her, no correspondence, nothing. It was as though the woman had existed for exactly 1 entry in a ledger, and then vanished from every official document that followed. She thanked Pell, and left before her expression could betray how significant this small discovery truly was. Cale had a wife before me, she wrote that night, her hand moving quickly across the page. Her name was Adeline. She is listed once, in a wedding ledger from 6 years ago, and never again, in any record I can find. No death is recorded. No burial, no mention of illness, no mention of anything at all. She simply stops existing in the fortress's own paperwork, the same year the nursery was apparently last used. I do not yet know if she died, or if something worse happened to her, or if she is somehow, impossibly, still alive somewhere Cale has hidden her away. But I know now that the nursery is hers, and I believe the portrait above the cradle is her own face, and I believe that whatever happened to Adeline Ashgrave is the truth beneath every other lie I have uncovered in this place. 6 years. The number had come to her weeks earlier, unbidden, and now it sat in the ledger in front of her in black ink, confirmed. 6 years since a wedding feast was recorded for a woman who no longer existed in any paper this fortress kept. I intend to find out what happened to her, whatever it costs me to learn it. She finally found the courage to test Rennick's trust 3 days later, choosing her moment carefully, a quiet afternoon in the covered walkway again, where their earlier conversation had first cracked open the possibility of alliance. Rennick, she said, without preamble, once she was certain they were alone. Who was Adeline? His entire body went still. It was such a complete, involuntary reaction that Alira knew immediately she had struck something real. Not a fabricated mystery, not an old rumor exaggerated by servants' gossip, but a genuine wound, one that Rennick clearly still carried after all these years. Where did you hear that name? His voice had lost its usual easy warmth, replaced by something guarded and careful. I found it in a household ledger, a wedding recorded 6 years ago. I found nothing else about her anywhere in this fortress's records. Rennick was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, on the rain-soaked garden below. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant, as though the words were being dragged out of him against his own better judgment. Adeline was his first wife, he said. Before the treaty with your father's pack, they married young, before either of us truly understood what ruling this fortress would cost. He paused, something like old grief flickering across his features. The official story is that she died in childbirth, that the child died with her. It is not spoken of, and Cale has never once, in 6 years, allowed anyone to raise the subject in his presence. But you don't believe the official story, Alira said quietly. It was not a question. Rennick's silence stretched long enough that Alira began to think he would not answer at all. Then, finally, barely above a whisper, he said the words that would change everything she thought she understood about the fortress, about her husband, and about the 6 years of silence buried beneath its careful walls. There is no grave, he said. I have looked. In 6 years I have never found a single grave for either Adeline or the child, and I have never been brave enough to ask Cale directly why that is. Cale found her in the archive room 2 weeks later, and the fury in his face told Alira, instantly, that he already knew exactly what she had been searching for. Pell tells me you've been asking about fortress history, he said, his voice low and controlled, in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. He closed the door behind him, and the archive room, usually so quiet and comfortable, suddenly felt very small. Genealogies, old ledgers, 6 years of records. Alira set down the document she had been reading and made herself meet his eyes, refusing to let her hands shake. I told you before, I know very little about the man I married. I was curious. Curious. He crossed the room slowly, and Alira forced herself not to step backward, though every instinct told her to. Or you've been listening to servants' gossip and decided to play investigator in my own fortress. Is there something in these records you don't want me to find? The question hung in the air between them, sharper than she had intended, and for a moment, Alira thought she had finally pushed too far. Cale's jaw tightened, the Winter Lake eyes going hard and distant, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. There are things in this fortress that are not yours to uncover, he said. Not because I wish to deceive you, but because some truths cost more than curiosity is worth. You would be wise to remember that. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting. He turned to leave, and something in Alira, some combination of 6 weeks of careful observation, a hidden nursery, a name erased from every ledger, and Rennick's quiet, grief-stricken confession about a grave that did not exist, broke through the caution she had maintained since her first night in this fortress. Adeline, she said. Cale stopped as though he had walked into a wall. He did not turn around immediately. For a long moment he simply stood there, back to her, shoulders rigid, and Alira watched the careful control he wore, like armor crack, just slightly, at the edges. When he finally turned to face her, the fury was still there, but underneath it, for the first time since she had arrived in this fortress, she saw something else entirely, something raw, something that looked, impossibly, like pain. "Do not," he said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "Speak that name to me again." "Why not?" Alira kept her voice as gentle as she could manage, sensing, somehow, that this moment was different from every careful negotiation they had shared before. "What happened to her, Cale? That is not your concern. I am your wife. Whatever this arrangement is between us, that is what I am. And there is a nursery in the West Wing that someone still cleans, still cares for, 6 years after a wedding, that was never followed by any record of what happened next. If that is not my concern, I do not know what would be." Something in Cale's expression shifted then, a war visible behind his eyes between two instincts Alira could not fully name. The instinct to shut the conversation down completely, the way he had shut down every question before it, and something else, something almost like exhaustion, as if the effort of carrying this particular secret for 6 years had finally worn thin enough that a single crack threatened to become a flood. "She is not dead," he said finally, so quietly that Alira almost missed it. The words landed like a physical blow. Alira had suspected as much, in the darkest corners of her speculation, but hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud by the one man who would know the truth beyond any doubt, felt entirely different from suspicion. "Then where is she?" Cale's face closed again, the crack sealing itself as quickly as it had opened, as though he had caught himself confessing something he could not afford to say aloud. "I have told you more than I intended already. This conversation is finished." "Cale, it is finished," he said, sharper now, and the Winterlake eyes had gone cold again, though Alira thought she could still see, buried somewhere beneath the ice, the raw thing that had briefly surfaced. "You will not speak of this again. Not to me, not to Rennick, not to anyone in this fortress. Do you understand?" Alira held his gaze, her heart pounding, and forced herself to nod, though every instinct in her now burned with the certainty that she had finally touched the true center of everything she had been documenting for weeks. He left without another word, and Alira remained alone in the archive room for a long time afterward, trembling not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of what she now knew. She is not dead. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her writing desk long after the candle had burned low, journal open, transcribing the conversation as precisely as she could remember it, word for word, cipher symbols filling page after page in her careful, private hand. He confirmed it himself. "Adeline is not dead. Whatever story exists about her death in childbirth, whatever grave Rennick could never find because there is no grave to find, it is because she is alive somewhere, hidden, silenced, erased from every record this fortress keeps. I saw something in him tonight I have not seen before. Not simply the careful, controlled king who told me on my first night here that our marriage was nothing more than a wall of paper. Something underneath that control. Something that looked almost like grief, or guilt, or both at once. I do not know yet what happened between Cale and Adeline, whether he is the reason she was hidden away, or whether some other force in this fortress made that choice, and he has simply carried the secret because revealing it now would cost him everything he has built since. But I know this. A man does not react the way he reacted tonight, over a wife he claims to have lost 6 years ago, unless the loss is far more complicated than a simple death would ever be. She closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long while, thinking of the portrait above the cradle, the gentle, uncertain smile of a woman whose name had become forbidden inside her own home. She thought of the missing servant, of Corin's midnight injury, of every careful lie she had catalogued since her first night in this fortress, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that all of it led back to the same buried center. Whatever happened to Adeline Ashgrave 6 years ago was the true story this fortress had spent every day since trying to bury. The following morning, Netta arrived with breakfast and an unusual nervousness in her manner, glancing repeatedly toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "You spoke with the king yesterday," she said, Once she was certain the corridor outside was empty, it was not a question. You've heard. Everyone has heard. He does not raise his voice often, my lady. And when he does, word travels fast in a place this size. Netta's hands twisted anxiously at the edge of her apron. I would ask you to be careful. Whatever you asked him, whatever answer you were seeking, there is a reason this fortress has stayed silent about it for 6 years. Silence has kept people safe here. Questions have not. What happened to her, Netta? Illyra asked quietly. You knew her, didn't you, before? Netta's face went pale, and for a moment, Illyra thought she would refuse to answer entirely, retreating behind the same careful fear that governed every other servant in the fortress. But something in her expression shifted, some old loyalty resurfacing despite the risk, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. She was kind, Netta said. Gentle. In a way, this fortress has forgotten how to be. She used to bring bread to the stable hands herself, rather than sending a servant to do it. She sang, sometimes, in the gardens, when she thought no one could hear her. Netta's eyes had gone bright with unshed tears. 6 years of grief surfacing all at once. And then, one autumn, she was simply gone. No farewell, no explanation. The king shut himself away for a month afterward, and when he emerged, he was not the same man who had married her. Colder, harder, as though something in him had been locked away along with whatever happened to her. Do you believe she is dead? Netta hesitated for a long moment, glancing once more toward the door. I believe, she said finally, that this fortress has told itself a story it needs to believe, because the alternative is too dangerous to speak of aloud. I do not know what happened to Adeline, but I have never once believed the story we were given. She left quickly after that, as though the confession itself had frightened her more than any punishment Cale might deliver for it, and Illyra sat alone with her breakfast growing cold, the pieces of 6 years finally beginning to assemble themselves into a shape she could almost, but not quite, fully see. She reached beneath the floorboard and added Netta's words to the journal, alongside everything else, and beneath it, in careful cipher, she wrote a single line that would guide every step of the investigation still ahead of her. Somewhere in this world, Adeline Ashgrave is still alive, and I intend to find her before this fortress finds a way to bury the truth completely. The hand closed over her wrist before she could lift the floorboard, and Illyra's breath caught in her throat as she spun to find Corwin standing in her doorway, his sharp eyes fixed not on her, but on the loose plank beneath her bed. I did knock, he said mildly, though nothing about his presence in her locked chambers felt remotely mild. You did not answer. I grew concerned. You have no right to enter my rooms without permission. Illyra kept her voice steady, despite the panic clawing up her throat, positioning herself instinctively between Corwin and the floorboard, though she knew the movement had already given away exactly what she was trying to protect. The king's advisor has certain privileges when the safety of the household is in question. Corwin's gaze finally lifted from the floor to meet hers, and there was nothing warm in it, nothing that pretended at courtesy. There have been reports, my lady, whispers, that the new bride has been asking unusual questions, reading old ledgers, speaking with the king about matters best left undisturbed. I have done nothing but try to understand my own home. Of course. Corwin's thin mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. Then you will not mind if I take a brief look around your chambers. To ease my own concerns, if nothing else. Illyra's mind raced. The journal sat inches from her feet, hidden beneath a floorboard that Corwin had already glanced at twice, and she had perhaps seconds to act before his search became inevitable. She thought quickly, desperately, of anything that might redirect his attention, and settled on the only weapon she had, the same careful composure that had gotten her through every dangerous conversation since her arrival. Search if you must, she said, forcing calm into her voice, even as her heart hammered. Though I would think the king's advisor has better uses of his time than searching a bride's chambers for nothing more than a private diary. She let the word diary land deliberately, watching his expression for any reaction. I keep a journal, Master Corwin. Thoughts of home, poems, occasionally, though I am no great poet. If that is the crime you suspect me of, you are welcome to read every word, though I suspect you will find them dreadfully dull. It was, she knew, an enormous gamble, offering the truth wrapped in a lie, convincing enough to survive scrutiny, banking on the possibility that Corwin's suspicion was general rather than specific, that he did not yet know the journal existed in any particular form, let alone that it was written in a cipher no outsider could read. Corwin studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Alira forced herself not to look toward the floorboard again, not to give away with her eyes what she had almost given away with her body a moment before. "A diary," he repeated slowly. "How touching." He took a single step forward, and for one terrible second, Alira believed he intended to search the room regardless of her offer. Then, from the corridor outside, a servant's voice called his name, urgent and apologetic, something about a dispute in the kitchens requiring his immediate attention. Corwin's eyes narrowed, weighing the interruption against his suspicion, before he finally stepped back toward the door. "This is not finished," he said, his voice carrying a warning she understood completely. "I will be watching you, my lady, closely." He left without another word, and Alira remained frozen in place for a long moment after his footsteps faded down the corridor, waiting until she was absolutely certain he would not return, before her legs finally gave out beneath her, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, shaking. That had been close. Too close. She did not retrieve the journal that night, too afraid that Corwin might have left someone watching her door. Instead, she lay awake for hours, turning the near miss over in her mind, understanding with sudden clarity that her previous cipher, however clever, however personal, was no longer safe enough. A journal that could be found beneath a floorboard, opened and read by anyone with enough patience to study its symbols, was a liability she could no longer afford, not now that Corwin's suspicion had been fully awakened. By morning, she had made her decision. The old cipher had to be abandoned entirely, replaced with something far more complex, something rooted so deeply in her own private memories that no outside mind, however patient or clever, could ever hope to reconstruct its logic. She spent the following days rebuilding her code from nothing, drawing on memories so specific to her own life that they would mean nothing to anyone else. The exact words her mother had sung to her as a child, half remembered before her mother's death. The private names she and her younger sister had once given to constellations visible from their childhood window. Small personal jokes and references that existed nowhere except inside her own mind. She layered these references into a system of substitution and misdirection so intricate that even she occasionally had to pause and think carefully before translating her own thoughts onto the page. It took nearly a week to fully rebuild the system, transcribing her previous entries into the new cipher during stolen hours when she was certain no one watched her door, burning the old drafts afterward in the small hearth in her chambers until nothing remained but ash. When she finished, she felt, for the first time since Corwin's hand had closed over her wrist, something close to safety again. Rebuilt the cipher completely, she wrote in the new code, her hand moving with the same care she had once used at 11 years old, building the original version out of a child's hurt and stubbornness. This version is tied so closely to my own memories that even under torture, I doubt I could explain it to someone else quickly enough for them to use it against me. Corwin suspects something. I do not yet know how much, but I will not make the mistake of underestimating him again. She hid the journal in a new location this time, no longer trusting the floorboard that Corwin had already glanced at twice. Instead, she carved a narrow hollow into the spine of an old prayer book Netta had given her during her first week in the fortress, a gift meant to offer comfort in an unfamiliar place, and slid the journal inside, disguised among pages of scripture that no one, not even a suspicious advisor searching for evidence of treachery, would think to examine too closely. Rennick found her 3 days later in the covered walkway, his expression tighter than she had seen it since their conversation about Adeline weeks earlier. "Corwin has been asking questions about you," he said, without preamble, glancing over his shoulder before continuing. "He came to me yesterday, asking whether I had noticed anything unusual in your behavior, whether you had asked me about matters that should remain private." Alira's pulse quickened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him nothing, because there was nothing to tell that concerned him." Rennick's jaw tightened. "But I want you to understand something, Alira. Corwin has been the king's most loyal advisor since before Adeline vanished. If anyone in this fortress knows the true story of what happened to her, it is him. And if he believes you are close to uncovering it, he will not simply watch and wait. He will act." The warning settled into Alira's chest like a stone, confirming every instinct that had driven her to rebuild her cipher over the past week. Then I will be careful. Careful may not be enough. Rennick studied her for a long moment, something conflicted crossing his features, as though he were weighing a decision he had been circling for weeks. Finally, he exhaled slowly and said, I have been thinking, since our conversation about Adeline, about things I noticed at the time, and never questioned closely enough. Corwin was the one who told Cale she had died in childbirth. He was the one who arranged the story, quietly, before Cale had even fully recovered from whatever grief consumed him that autumn. I never thought much of it before. Grief makes people rely on those closest to them for difficult tasks. But now I wonder whether Corwin arranged more than the telling of that story. You think he was involved in whatever actually happened to her? I think, Rennick said carefully, that I have spent 6 years trusting a story I never fully believed, because questioning it felt disloyal to a friend who was already broken by grief. I do not want to make that mistake any longer. It was, Illyra understood, the closest thing to an alliance Rennick had offered her since their first careful conversation in this same walkway weeks earlier, and she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders alongside everything she already carried, the journal, the cipher, the growing certainty that Adeline was alive somewhere beyond these walls, and that Corwin, whatever his true role in her disappearance, was now watching Illyra's every move with dangerous, focused suspicion. We should be careful how much we share with each other, she said finally, thinking of Corwin's hand closing over her wrist, of how close she had come to losing everything she had documented. Not because I don't trust you, Rennick. Because Corwin is watching, and the less either of us knows in detail, the less either of us can be forced to reveal. Rennick nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. Then we work carefully, separately, where we must. Together, where we can. Together, where we can, Illyra agreed. Neither of them spoke of it again that afternoon, but as Illyra walked back to her chambers, the rebuilt journal safely hidden inside its prayer book disguise, she felt the shape of the investigation shifting beneath her, becoming something larger than a single bride's quiet suspicion. She was no longer alone in this fortress, watching lies accumulate in isolated silence. She had an ally now, one with access to rooms and conversations she could never reach on her own. And together, carefully, separately where they must be, they had begun building something that Corwin's suspicion, however sharp, would eventually be powerless to stop. The old healer's cottage sat at the far edge of the valley, half a day's ride from the fortress, and Illyra had never intended to find herself standing at its door, until Netta mentioned, almost in passing, that the woman who lived there had once served as the fortress's midwife. She delivered half the children born within these walls for 30 years, Netta said one afternoon, folding linens with the quiet efficiency that had become their shared, comfortable ritual. Retired now, though, left the fortress not long after Lady Adeline's supposed death. Never came back, not even for festivals. Illyra kept her hands steady on the fabric she was folding, though her mind had already begun racing. Do you know why she left? Netta shrugged, though something careful crossed her expression. Grief, most said. She'd delivered the lady's child herself, or so the story goes. Perhaps it was too painful to remain somewhere that reminded her of it every day. It was, Illyra understood immediately, exactly the kind of thread she had been searching for since Cale's confession weeks earlier. If Adeline had truly died in childbirth, the midwife who attended the birth would know the truth beyond any doubt. And if the story was a lie, as Illyra now firmly believed, the midwife might be the one person outside the fortress who knew exactly how that lie had been constructed. Arranging the journey took careful planning. Illyra could not simply request permission to leave the fortress without explanation, not with Corwin's suspicion still sharp and watchful, so she constructed a reason that would withstand scrutiny, a desire to visit the small chapel in the valley town, a common enough request for a new bride still adjusting to her circumstances, one that Cale, when asked, granted without particular interest, distracted as he was by a border dispute that had consumed his attention for the better part of a week. Rennick arranged for a quiet escort, 2 guards he trusted personally rather than any assigned by Corwin, and by mid-morning, Illyra found herself riding away from the fortress for the first time since her wedding, the valley opening wide and unfamiliar around her, green and quiet in a way the fortress's gray stone walls never allowed. The healer's name was Ossery, and she answered her door with the wary caution of someone long accustomed to living alone, her sharp eyes taking in Alira's fine traveling cloak, and the guards waiting a respectful distance behind her. "You're the new bride," Osiri said, before Alira had spoken a single word. "Word travels, even out here." "I was hoping to speak with you," Alira said carefully, "about Lady Adeline." Something shuddered immediately behind the old woman's eyes, and for a moment, Alira feared she had made a fatal misstep, that Osiri would simply close the door and refuse to speak further. But instead, after a long, searching look, the healer stepped back and gestured her inside, glancing once toward the guards with clear instruction that they remain outside. The cottage was small and smelled of dried herbs, shelves lined with jars, and bundled plants gathered over what looked like decades of careful practice. Osiri settled into a worn chair by the hearth and studied Alira for a long moment before speaking. "You've come a long way to ask about a woman most people in that fortress have been told to forget." "I don't believe the story I've been told," Alira said. "I don't believe she died in childbirth. I need to know the truth." Osiri's weathered face tightened, old grief and old anger warring visibly across her features. "You're braver than I expected, or more foolish. Either way, I suppose you deserve honesty, since you've ridden half a day for it." She was quiet for a long moment, gathering herself, before finally speaking. "Adeline did not die in childbirth. There was no child. She was pregnant, yes, in her final months at the fortress, further along than most women her size typically carry. But the birth never happened, not while I was there." Alira's heart pounded. Then what happened? She disappeared, 3 weeks before her expected time. One night she was in her chambers, heavy with child, frightened but healthy. The next morning, she was simply gone, and within a day, the fortress was already telling a story about a birth gone wrong, a mother and child lost together. I was told to confirm the story to anyone who asked, told that speaking otherwise would cost me my position, perhaps far worse than that. Osiri's hands trembled slightly where they rested in her lap. "I left within the month. I could not stand to keep repeating a lie about a woman I had cared for, a woman who was kind to me in ways few nobles bothered to be." "Who told you to confirm the story?" Osiri's eyes met Alira's directly, unflinching despite the old fear still visible beneath her steady gaze. "Corwin," she said, "the king's advisor. He came to me himself, the very morning after she vanished, already certain of exactly what story the fortress would tell." The confirmation landed with such weight that Alira had to steady herself against the arm of her chair. Every suspicion she had carried since Rennick's confession weeks earlier crystallized into something undeniable. Corwin had not simply repeated a story handed to him by grief. He had constructed the story himself, within hours of Adeline's disappearance, before anyone else in the fortress had time to ask questions or demand proof. "Do you believe Kale was involved?" Alira asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Osiri considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe," she said slowly, "that the king was genuinely devastated when he learned she was gone. I saw him myself, in the days after, and no man can fake that particular kind of grief, not convincingly, not for as long as he carried it. But I also believe he accepted Corwin's story far too quickly for a man who truly wanted the truth. Whether that was grief clouding his judgment, or something closer to willful blindness, I could not say. Perhaps even he does not fully know." It matched, Alira realized, exactly what Kale himself had revealed in the archive room weeks earlier. The raw confession that Adeline was not dead, delivered with genuine anguish, followed immediately by a refusal to say anything more. He knew something. He had known for years, but the depth of what he knew, and how much of it he had chosen not to examine too closely, remained an open question that only he could answer fully. "Do you have any idea where she might be now?" Alira asked. "If she did not die that night, she must have gone somewhere." Osiri shook her head slowly. "I have wondered that question every day for 6 years, and I have never found an answer. But I will tell you this." She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, more urgent. "There was a wagon that left the fortress that same night, before dawn, driven by one of Corwin's own men. I saw it myself from my window, though I never spoke of it to anyone until this very moment. If Adeline left the fortress alive, that wagon is where she left in." Alira rode back toward the fortress in near silence, her mind working through every piece of the story Osiri had given her, weaving it carefully into the growing tapestry of evidence she had been assembling for months. By the time the gray walls came into view against the darkening sky, she had already composed, in her mind, exactly how the entry would read in her journal that night. Spoke with the former fortress midwife, Ossury, who delivered the truth I have been searching for since Cale's confession weeks ago. There was no birth, no death in childbirth. Adeline disappeared 3 weeks before her expected delivery, healthy and afraid, and vanished from the fortress entirely within a single night. Corwin constructed the official story within hours, before anyone had time to question it, and threatened Ossury into confirming it publicly. A wagon left the fortress that same night, driven by one of Corwin's men, before dawn. If Adeline is alive, and I believe now, more than ever, that she is, that wagon carried her away from everything she knew, into a silence 6 years deep. I do not yet know where that road leads, but I intend to follow it, however long it takes, however dangerous the search becomes. She hid the journal that night more carefully than ever before, aware now, with absolute certainty, that Corwin's suspicion of her was not paranoia, born of a loyal advisor's caution. It was the fear of a man who knew exactly what secret he had buried, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the fortress, precisely how dangerous the truth would be if it ever found its way into the light. Rennick's face was pale when Elira found him waiting outside her chambers 3 days after her return from the valley, and the moment she saw him she knew something had shifted, something urgent enough to bring him to her door in broad daylight, heedless of who might see. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly, glancing down the corridor before stepping closer. "Somewhere private." They walked together to the covered walkway, their now familiar meeting place, and once Rennick was certain no one lingered within earshot, he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the easy warmth she had come to know, nor the careful caution of their earlier conversations, but something closer to fear. "I asked a stable hand about a wagon," he said, "6 years ago, driven by one of Corwin's men, leaving before dawn, on the night Adeline supposedly died." He paused, and Elira's pulse quickened, understanding immediately that he had somehow already begun retracing the same path she had followed to Ossury's cottage, perhaps prompted by suspicions of his own that had finally reached their breaking point. The stable hand remembered it, said the wagon was loaded heavily, more than a simple errand would require. Said Corwin's man returned 3 days later, alone, and never spoke of where he had gone. "Did you learn where the wagon traveled?" Rennick's jaw tightened. North, toward the border territories, past the reach of Cale's direct authority, but still within reach of Corwin's own family holdings. His mother's people control a small keep out there, isolated, far from any major roads. He met her eyes directly. "If Adeline is alive, Elira, I believe that is where she has been kept, hidden for 6 years, close enough that Corwin could maintain whatever control he needed, far enough that no one from the fortress would ever think to look." The pieces settled into place with a weight that left Elira momentarily breathless. She had spent weeks assembling fragments, a hidden nursery, an erased name, a midwife's testimony, a wagon disappearing into darkness, and now, finally, those fragments pointed toward an actual location, a place that existed on maps rather than merely in speculation and grief. "We need to be certain before we act," she said carefully, though every instinct in her screamed to ride north immediately, to see the truth with her own eyes. "If we move too quickly, without proof, Corwin will simply move her again, further away, somewhere we may never find." Rennick nodded slowly, though frustration was evident in the tight line of his shoulders. "I agree. But Elira, I need to tell you something else, something that has been troubling me since I began asking these questions." He hesitated, choosing his next words with visible care. "Corwin has noticed. He came to me again yesterday, more direct this time than before, asking specifically why I had been inquiring about old stable records. I denied any particular interest, but I do not believe he was convinced." Cold fear settled into Elira's chest. "Then we are running out of time." "I believe we are," Rennick agreed grimly, "which means we need to decide, soon, exactly what we intend to do with everything we have gathered. Confronting Cale directly seems the obvious choice, but I confess I do not know how he will react to learning the full truth all at once. He has spent 6 years believing, or perhaps forcing himself to believe, a story that protected him from a darker possibility. I do not know if he is ready to have that protection stripped away." Elira thought of the archive room, of the raw grief that had briefly surfaced behind Cale's careful control the moment she spoke Adeline's name aloud. "She is not dead," he had said, and something in his voice that day had suggested a man teetering on the edge of a truth he had spent years refusing to fully examine. "I think," she said slowly, "that some part of him already suspects everything we've learned." He confirmed she was alive, without any hesitation, the moment I pushed him hard enough. Perhaps what he lacks is not the suspicion, but the courage to act on it, knowing what confronting Corwin directly might cost him, politically and personally, after 6 years of believing the man was loyal beyond question. "Then perhaps," Rennick said carefully, "our task is not to give him information he does not already possess in some form. Perhaps it is to give him the courage, and the proof, to finally act on what he has spent 6 years refusing to see." That night, Elira sat alone at her writing desk, long after the fortress had gone quiet, the prayer book open before her, journal pages filled with 6 years of careful, ciphered evidence. She read back through everything she had gathered since her first night in this place: the missing servant, Corin's midnight injury, the intercepted letter proving her father had never broken any truce, the hidden nursery, the ledger entry that marked the only official record of Adeline's existence, Netta's quiet grief, Ossory's testimony about the wagon, and the lie Corwin had constructed within hours of a disappearance he clearly orchestrated himself. It was, she realized as she turned the pages, no longer simply a bride's private diary, nor even a careful record of a husband's political deceptions. It had become something far larger, a documented history of exactly how Corwin had manipulated Cale's grief to seize and maintain control over a secret capable of destroying the fortress's careful peace, and how that manipulation had cost an innocent woman 6 years of her life, hidden away from everyone who might have fought for her freedom. 6 years, she wrote, the final entry of that long night. 6 years since a wedding was recorded and then erased. 6 years since a grieving man accepted a story too quickly, and a calculating advisor built an entire fortress of silence on top of that grief. I do not know yet how this ends, but I know now, with complete certainty, that ending it requires more than careful observation and hidden journals. It requires proof strong enough to survive Corwin's denial, and courage strong enough to present that proof where it cannot be quietly buried alongside everything else this fortress has already lost. Rennick believes we are running out of time. I believe he is right. Whatever happens next, I intend to make certain that 6 years of silence does not become 7. She closed the journal, hid it carefully within its disguise, and lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind move through the neglected garden outside her window, thinking of a woman she had never met, hidden somewhere north of these walls, waiting 6 years for someone brave enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to finally come looking for her. The opportunity to act came sooner than either of them expected, and far more dangerously than Elira had prepared for. 2 days later, a summons arrived at her chambers, not from Cale, but from Corwin himself, requesting her presence in his private study before the evening meal. The formal wording of the request did nothing to soften the cold dread that settled into her stomach the moment Netta delivered it, her hands trembling slightly as she passed along the folded parchment. "You don't have to go," Netta whispered, though they both understood that refusing a direct summons from the king's chief advisor would raise exactly the kind of suspicion Elira had spent months trying to avoid. "I have no choice," Elira said quietly, though her mind was already racing through every possible reason Corwin might have for requesting this meeting, and every possible danger it might represent. She dressed carefully that evening, composing her expression into the same calm, unreadable mask she had worn since her very first night in this fortress, and walked to Corwin's study, with her pulse hammering beneath layers of careful control. Whatever waited behind that door, she understood, with grim certainty, that the careful game of watching and gathering evidence from a safe distance had finally, unavoidably, come to its end. Corwin's study was lit by a single lamp, and he did not rise when Elira entered, did not offer her a seat, simply watched her from behind his desk with the patient, calculating stillness of a man who already believed he held every advantage in the room. She did, though every instinct screamed against sealing herself into a private room with a man she now believed capable of orchestrating a woman's 6-year disappearance. She kept her hand near the door handle regardless, a small, useless comfort against whatever might come next. "You've been busy," Corwin said, his voice mild in a way that felt far more threatening than open hostility would have. A journey to the valley, ostensibly to visit a chapel, questions asked in the stables about old wagon routes. Rennick, suddenly curious about matters he has shown no interest in for 6 years. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with cold, unblinking patience. I am not a foolish man, my lady. I know precisely what pattern these small movements suggest. Alira's heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain level. I don't know what you're suggesting. I think you do. Corwin rose slowly, circling the desk with unhurried menace, and stopped a careful distance from her, close enough to be intimidating, far enough to maintain the appearance of civility should anyone interrupt them. I have protected this fortress for 6 years, my lady. I have protected the king from a truth that would have destroyed him, and destroyed the fragile peace this region depends on. Whatever you believe you have discovered, whatever fragments you have pieced together with Rennick's help, I promise you this: the consequences of exposing it will fall far heavier on the people you claim to protect than on me. Is that a threat? It is a warning, offered out of what remains of my patience. His voice hardened, the mild mask finally slipping to reveal something colder underneath. Adeline Ashgrave is exactly where she needs to be, for reasons far more complicated than a curious bride could possibly understand in a few short months. If you continue pulling at this thread, you will not simply endanger yourself, you will endanger her, and you will endanger the king, who has spent 6 years building a stable rule on top of a wound he believes has finally healed. Tearing that open again, without understanding the full weight of what you are dealing with, is not bravery. It is recklessness. Alira studied him carefully, searching for any crack in his composure the way she had once watched for cracks in Cale's, and found instead something far more disturbing: genuine, unwavering conviction. Corwin did not believe himself a villain in this story. He believed himself its protector, its careful architect, and that certainty made him infinitely more dangerous than simple cruelty ever could have. If your reasons are as sound as you claim, she said carefully, then perhaps it is time the king heard them directly, rather than continuing to carry a grief built on a lie you constructed for him. Something flashed behind Corwin's eyes, quick and sharp, gone almost before she registered it. The king knows what he needs to know. The king told me himself that she is not dead. He has known that much for 6 years, and yet you have never once given him the chance to decide for himself what should happen next. That is not protection, Master Corwin. That is control. For a long, tense moment, Corwin said nothing, and Alira understood she had finally struck at the true center of his careful architecture. Not simply the secret itself, but the 6 years of power he had built by being the only man who held it completely. You will regret pursuing this further, he said finally, his voice dropping low and cold. That is the only warning I intend to offer you. He turned back to his desk, a clear dismissal, and Alira left the study, with her hands trembling, though she did not allow the tremor to show until she was safely back within the privacy of her own chambers. Word reached Cale within a day. Whether Corwin had told him directly, or whether some servant had overheard enough of the study confrontation to carry fragments of it through the fortress's ever-present network of whispers, Alira never learned for certain. She only knew that by the following evening, a guard arrived at her door with a summons far more urgent than Corwin's had been, requesting her immediate presence in the king's private chambers. She found Cale standing at the same tower window, where their very first conversation had taken place months earlier, though the man who turned to face her now bore little resemblance to the coldly composed king who had once told her their marriage was nothing more than a wall of paper. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, and something in his posture suggested a man who had not slept in days. Corwin tells me you have been asking questions, he said, without preamble, about Adeline, about wagons and stable records and a midwife who left the fortress 6 years ago. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual careful control. Tell me the truth. What have you found? Alira hesitated only a moment before deciding, finally and completely, that careful half-truths had brought her as far as they could. Whatever came next required honesty, however dangerous it proved to be. I believe Adeline did not die in childbirth, she said quietly. I believe there was no birth at all. I believe she disappeared, healthy and afraid, 3 weeks before her expected time, and that Corwin constructed the story of her death within hours, before you had any chance to question it. I believe a wagon carried her north that same night, to a keep controlled by Corwin's own family, where I believe she has been kept, hidden, for the past 6 years. The silence that followed stretched so long that Alira began to wonder if he had stopped breathing entirely. When Cale finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely audible, raw in a way she had never heard from him before. I have wondered, he said slowly, every single day for 6 years, whether the grief I carried was grief for a death, or grief for a truth I was too afraid to examine closely enough to find. He turned back toward the window, his shoulders bowed under a weight Alira suspected he had never once allowed anyone to see. Corwin came to me that morning, already certain, already composed, already offering me a story that let me grieve simply and completely, rather than question anything at all. I was drowning, Alira. I let him hand me a raft, and I never once asked whether it was built from truth or convenience. You could ask now, Alira said gently. You could ask him directly. With everything I've gathered as proof, you could demand the truth, rather than continuing to accept the silence he has offered you for 6 years. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned back to face her, something had shifted in his expression. Not the raw grief of a moment before, but something harder, more determined, the first genuine resolve Alira had seen in him since her arrival in this fortress. Show me everything, he said. Every piece of proof you have gathered. I want to see it all, before I confront him with anything less than absolute certainty. This was the moment she had been building toward since her very first night in this fortress, since a frightened girl had hidden a childhood cipher beneath a loose floorboard, uncertain what secrets she might one day need to protect. 6 years of buried truth, documented carefully in a language only she could read, was about to become the evidence that finally forced this fortress's greatest lie into the light. I will need to retrieve something, she said quietly. It will take a moment. And Cale. She paused, meeting his eyes directly, wanting him to understand fully what he was about to see. What I've written was never meant for anyone else to read. It has been my only truly private space in this entire fortress. I am trusting you with it because I believe, finally, that you are ready to see everything it contains. Something passed across his face then, something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine gratitude beneath the exhaustion and grief. Thank you, he said simply, and for the first time since their wedding night, the words did not feel like a formality exchanged between strangers, but something closer to an honest connection, finally beginning to take root between two people who had spent months circling each other with careful, guarded distance. Alira left to retrieve the journal, her mind already composing the words she would need to explain 6 years of cipher, 6 years of lies, and the truth that was, finally, about to demand its reckoning. The council hall had never been so full. Word had spread through the fortress overnight, the way word always did in a place built from stone corridors and whispered secrets. And by the time Alira walked into the hall the following morning beside Cale and Rennick, every noble, every advisor, every guard with rank enough to attend had gathered beneath the high vaulted ceiling, murmuring among themselves in nervous, uncertain tones. Corwin stood near his usual place at the council table, and Alira watched his composure falter, just slightly, when he saw the journal in her hands, its prayer book disguise abandoned, now that its secrets no longer needed protecting. What is the meaning of this? Corwin demanded, though his voice carried less certainty than it once had. Cale rose from his seat at the head of the table, and the hall fell silent almost instantly. 6 years of authority settling naturally over his shoulders, despite the raw exhaustion still visible in his eyes. For 6 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, I have believed a story about my wife's death. Last night, I learned that story was a lie, constructed within hours of her disappearance by a man I trusted completely. He turned to face Corwin directly. You will have the chance to answer for what you have done, but first, this council will hear the evidence that brought us to this moment. Alira stepped forward, journal open in her hands, and began to read. She had spent the previous night, after leaving Cale's chambers, translating the most critical entries from her private cipher into plain language, choosing each passage carefully to build an undeniable chain of evidence from her very first night in the fortress to this final, inevitable reckoning. She read of the missing servant and Corin's midnight injury, small early cracks in a pattern of careful deception, She read of the intercepted letter, proving her own father had never broken any truce, evidence Cale had possessed and buried before their marriage had even begun. She read of the hidden nursery, still cared for after 6 years of supposed abandonment, and the ledger entry that marked the only official record of Adeline's existence before her name vanished from every subsequent page. The hall listened in stunned silence as she continued, reading Netta's quiet testimony about a woman who sang in gardens and brought bread to stable hands herself, and Ossory's account of a healthy, frightened woman who disappeared 3 weeks before her expected time, followed within hours by a story Corwin constructed and enforced through threats against anyone who might question it. She read of the wagon that left before dawn, driven by Corwin's own man, traveling north toward a keep controlled by his family, far enough from the fortress that no one would think to search, close enough that his control over the secret could remain absolute. When she finished, the silence in the hall was so complete that Alira could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the faint creak of the great doors somewhere behind her, could hear, finally, Corwin's voice, stripped now of all its earlier calm, rising in something close to desperation. "Everything I did was to protect this fortress," he said, his eyes darting between Cale and the assembled council, searching desperately for some ally who might still stand with him. The truth would have destroyed him, a king consumed by scandal, by a wife's disappearance under mysterious circumstances, would have invited every rival pack within 100 miles to test our weakness. I gave him a grief he could survive, rather than a scandal that would have torn this fortress apart. "You gave him a lie," Cale said, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority through the silent hall, "and stole 6 years of freedom from a woman who never once deserved to lose them. You did not protect me, Corwin. You protected the power my grief allowed you to hold." The council murmured its agreement, old loyalties shifting visibly, as the full weight of 6 years of deception settled over the hall. Rennick stepped forward then, standing beside Alira with the quiet solidarity of an ally who had helped build this reckoning from its earliest, most uncertain beginnings. "There is one more piece of evidence this council should hear," Rennick said, and at his signal, the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, thin and pale from years of confinement, but unmistakably alive, her dark hair streaked now with premature gray, her eyes finding Cale's across the length of the silent hall, with an expression that held equal parts fear, hope, and 6 years of buried grief finally beginning to surface. "Adeline," Cale breathed, and the composure he had maintained throughout the entire hearing finally broke completely as he crossed the hall toward her, every eye in the room, watching a king weep openly for the first time in living memory. Rennick had ridden north himself 2 nights earlier, the moment Cale agreed to confront Corwin directly, gathering enough armed men to secure her release before Corwin could learn of the confrontation and attempt to move her again. She had been found exactly where Ossory's testimony suggested, hidden away in an isolated keep, told for 6 years that speaking her true name to anyone would result in harm coming to the fortress she still, despite everything, cared about deeply. The reunion that followed was not the tearful joy of old stories, not immediately. 6 years of separation, of buried grief and constructed lies, could not simply dissolve in a single embrace. But as Alira watched Cale hold his first wife for the first time in 6 years, both of them shaking, both of them changed beyond recognition by everything that had happened since their separation, she understood that whatever came next for this fortress, it would begin, finally, with truth instead of silence. Corwin's fate was decided by the council that same afternoon, stripped of his title and his lands, exiled from the fortress and its territories entirely, forbidden ever to return under threat of far harsher justice. He left before nightfall, escorted by guards who had once respected him and now regarded him with nothing but cold contempt, and Alira felt no particular satisfaction watching him go, only a quiet, exhausted relief that 6 years of careful, dangerous silence had finally come to its end. The fortress spent the following weeks adjusting to a truth it had never expected to face. Adeline, slowly and carefully, began reclaiming pieces of the life that had been stolen from her, though everyone around her understood that healing from 6 years of hidden confinement would take far longer than a single reckoning could provide. Cale, for his part, seemed changed in ways that went beyond simple relief, softer somehow, as though 6 years of careful, guarded control had finally been allowed to crack open into something more honest. He found Illyra alone in the fortress gardens one evening, weeks after the council hearing, the herb garden beneath her window finally beginning to show signs of the careful tending she had given it since her arrival. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay," he said quietly, settling beside her on the stone bench. "You risked everything, from your very first night in this fortress, to uncover a truth I was too afraid to examine myself." "I did not do it alone," Illyra said. Rennick's courage matched my own, and Netta and Osiri, brave enough to speak truths they had carried in silence for years. "No," Kale agreed, "but it began with you. A cipher-locked journal, built to survive exactly this kind of danger, kept faithfully for months, despite every risk it carried." He studied her for a long moment, something gentler than she had ever seen from him settling into his expression. "Our marriage began as a wall between two packs, nothing more. I told you that myself, on the very first night we met." "I remember," Illyra said. "But I no longer believe that is all it can be." He met her eyes directly, and for the first time since her arrival in this fortress, Illyra saw a man entirely without the careful, guarded distance he had maintained since their very first conversation. "Adeline and I will need time to understand what our own future holds, separately from what happened between us before. But I would like the chance to know you properly, Illyra Hartley, not as a political arrangement, but as the person brave enough to uncover 6 years of buried truth, simply because silence felt wrong to her." Illyra considered his words carefully, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment. A frightened girl who had built a cipher out of childhood hurt, a bride who had arrived in a fortress full of strangers and secrets, a woman who had spent months documenting lies she refused to let stand unquestioned. She thought of Adeline, slowly healing within these same walls, and of the long, careful work still ahead for all of them. "I think," she said finally, "that this fortress has had enough silence to last a lifetime. Whatever comes next, I would rather build it honestly, one truth at a time, than return to the careful walls we started with." Kale nodded slowly, something like hope settling into his tired eyes, and together they sat in the quiet garden, as evening light faded over the fortress walls, no longer strangers bound by paper and obligation, but two people finally beginning, carefully and honestly, to build something real. That night, Illyra opened her journal one final time, the cipher no longer a desperate act of self-protection, but a quiet ritual of reflection she had come to value for its own sake. 6 years of lies uncovered in 6 months of careful watching. Adeline is free, Corwin is gone, and for the first time since I arrived in this fortress, I do not feel like I am gathering evidence against the world around me. I feel, instead, like I am finally allowed to simply live in it. Whatever comes next, I will keep writing. Not because I fear what this fortress might hide from me, but because some truths, even the small, ordinary ones, deserve to be remembered exactly as they happened. She closed the journal, set it gently on her writing desk, rather than hiding it beneath any floorboard or false cover, and for the first time in 6 months, slept through the entire night, without a single moment of fear.